My first job is to introduce our speaker. Professor David Graf of the University of Miami is an ancient historian and archaeologist specializing in the Graeco-Roman Near East. David has conducted excavations and surveys in the Nabataean world for the past 40 years. He is the author or editor of a distinguished portfolio of publications, and these include his work as the co-editor of the invaluable multi-volume Anchor Bible Dictionary and as the author of Rome and its Arabian Frontier from the Nabataeans to the Saracens, as well as more than 150 scholarly articles, many of which are on the Nabataeans. David Graf has conducted fieldwork in Turkey, Israel, Jordan, and Egypt, and he is currently directing excavations in the ancient Nabataean Roman city of Petra in Jordan. David has been a Fulbright Scholar in Saudi Arabia in 2003, a recipient of the Provost's Award for Scholarly Activity in 2008, a Fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities in Jordan in 2014, and he is currently a member of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. In this past year, David was the Seymour Gittin Distinguished Professor at the Albright Institute for Archaeological Research in Jerusalem. His most recent publication is on the Silk Road between Syria and China in Trade, Commerce, and the State in the Roman World, the third volume of the Oxford Roman Economy Project. David currently holds a Fulbright Award for 2022 for his work in Jordan and to produce a Cambridge University Press monograph on the Nabataeans. He will be based at ACOR. I can hear myself echoing on this. He will be based at ACOR, the American Center of Research, an international non-profit academic institution which advances understanding of Jordan and the Middle East, both past and present. David has close connections with us here in Britain, having held a post at Wolfson College in 1992. And when Anthony and I met David earlier in the month, he warmly remembered his meetings with the late Fergus Millar. And more recently, David has been working with our colleague in the Society, David Jacobson, on the inscriptions of Agrippa II. And on behalf of the Society, I want to express my thanks to David Jacobson for his efforts in securing David Graf for this, the first lecture in our autumn series. In the subjects of Nabataea and Judaea, we will be considering what are probably the best known of all the client kingdoms of Rome, and we very much look forward to David's lecture now on relations between the client kingdoms of Judaea and Nabataea. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. My compliments to your secretary, Sheila, who communicates so well and has been in constant contact with me. So let's hope that things go smoothly. This is a big subject, so there will be gaps and fissures in which I will ignore because of time, but let's just proceed. With the background and some of the literature that is involved. Perhaps the greatest stimulus to this subject was Edward Luttwak's The Grand Strategy of the Roman Empire, in which he set forth three stages of Julio-Claudian, followed by the Flavian to Severan dynasty, and then the third part, the Diocletian reorganization of the empire. But the first stage he called the client kingdoms. He was not a professional historian. I'm holding up the book, but I don't know that everybody can see it. It has gone into paperback and 40 years later was republished. It was considered a great contribution by Fergus Millar and others at the time, but with a caveat. The one aspect that he left out was communication. It's a vast empire, and how does the emperor control all of the successions that take place in the various client kingdoms across this vast empire? It was more appropriately perhaps called by Glenn Bowersock in a review, the emperor's burden. How does the emperor manage to control all of these client kingdoms across the vast empire? It was Luttwak's thesis that the area was surrounded by these client kingdoms as a buffer to prevent invasions and to help solidify the empire. Perhaps more distinguished and more well-known is David Braun's book, The Friendly King, the character of client kingship, which was produced in 1984, just 8 years later, which was a much more detailed analysis. I believe David Braun was a student of Fergus Miller, so that it's a nice little brief book, which was followed in 1990 by Richard Sullivan's huge tome called Near Eastern Royalty and Rome. I had lunch with Richard and his wife in Toronto before it was published in the 80s, and he unfortunately died just a year or two later, I think in 1988. And so the book was published posthumously, but it's a detailed analysis of all of the various client kingdoms. Of course, as was said at the very beginning, the two kingdoms that we're looking at are perhaps the best known of any of the kingdoms across the Roman Empire. On the periphery, the Judean kingship of Herod the Great, which we owe to Josephus, who has given us a detailed analysis of that kingdom. So we know more about the Judean client kingdom, as we call it, than any other. And then the Nabataean Kingdom. We have no Josephus. He does mention the Nabataeans, so there's a great deal of interaction between the two in which he picks up on various aspects. In fact, Josephus's apparatus for the succession of the Nabataean kings has been duplicated by the inscriptions of the Nabataeans. We now have probably over 7,000 Nabataean inscriptions, more than any other kingdom that I know of across the Roman Empire. Of course, it is usually pointed out that many of these are not, yes, the first slide is fine. Many of these inscriptions are very brief and provide very little information, but they are dated, over 100 of them, so that we can organize the chronology of Josephus pretty precisely as a result. The first slide is appropriate. Next. Now, one of the problems with this subject is terminology and the various paradigms that have been proposed. The term client state is dependent on a paradigm of Roman patron-client relations, but the term client never appears to be used to designate any of the kingdoms. The importance is that a patron and a client indicate superior to inferior, And these client kingdoms didn't necessarily look at themselves as inferior. So that the more appropriate metaphor or paradigm to explain these kingdoms is that of friendship. Amicitia seems to be the Latin term that is used for them, or philia in Greek, for these royal rulers on the Roman periphery. So that it seems, as David Braun said in his book, as his primary title, they are the friendly kings in alliance with Rome, federates of the Roman Empire. So they have a relationship, but the relationship is a mutual reciprocal relationship. Next. So how does one become a client king? The emphasis is that it had to be a recognition by the emperor and the Senate to accept a king on the periphery as a ally, so that the terminology is the allied and friendly king. This policy was considered to be economical rather than conquest, which involved annexation and a costly enterprise of having to supply an infrastructure and governors and an apparatus to control a region. There was a flexibility, a freedom that existed in these kingdoms on the periphery, where they could conduct their own business in of course, relationship to Roman interests, and they served as a buffer from any enemies. In the east, of course, the Parthians. In the north, various Germanic tribes were a problem, so that a whole series of allied kingdoms existed. We know, as I said, very little about them except for Judea and the Nabataeans. Next. So the problem for our subject is that Herod the Great's kingdom extended far beyond Judea. There was the acquisition of some territories that David Jacobson, in his recent splendid book on Agrippa II, emphasizes. The Trachonitis, Botania, Auranitis, all in that brown area that is in the upper part of the slide, with the Iterans also involved. And then further to the south, just east of Jerusalem, there was an extension in the Hasmonean period of an area called the Petra, or the area beyond the Jordan, that was a province. And the problem with both of these is this brown area of the Trachonitis was occupied by Nabataeans, and the area of the Perea was adjacent to many Nabataean settlements in Transjordan, so that the two were coming into contact and collision. So there has to be a great deal of diplomacy, and there were a number of incidents of conflict, as we will see as well. So this is not a stable area, it's an area in flux. Unlike Roman historians who talk about a limes, there's no stagnant border here of forts and a borderline that distinguishes the two kingdoms, so that it depended on the rulers and events. And I think Fergus Miller put this very well in an article back in the 1980s, that the area was in constant change. And so Roman decisions were ad hoc. It depended on circumstances and events. So there could be no grand strategy, as Ludwig tried to suggest. And of course, since 1976, in the last 40 years, we've learned that American diplomacy has not been that great. And we have, with all of our modern technology, a lack of understanding of foreign peoples and countries. So the same quagmire must have existed for the Roman Empire in relationship to these various kingdoms, which we may call a world of friendly kings. Do I hear a comment? Next. So the tendency has been in the literature to use Herod as the paragon of a Rex Socius, a friendly king or allied king. I might use, I've been looking at Tacitus's annals recently, and when he talks about the kings, he always says the allied kings. The allied kings. He never uses the term client. It's the allied kings. This is the term. So the assumption is that the king was conferred, that his title was something that was bestowed by the Roman emperor and not inherited. In fact, in Schur's discussion of this point, he indicates that that the kings were not inherited across the whole empire. There's no inherited kingship. Secondly, it is assumed that Roman citizenship was typical of the kings based on Herod the Great. And thirdly, that the sons of the kings were sent to the imperial capital for education. And more than a half dozen, maybe as many as 8 of Herod's children were sent to Rome. Then there intermarriage with the neighboring kingdoms. This was something that Sullivan emphasized in his treatise in 1990, was the intricate intermarriage between these various kingdoms across the empire. And then finally, as Herod illustrates, there was the founding of cities in honor of the emperor, from Caesarea Maritima on the coast to Sebaste or Samaria adjacent to Judea, and then further to the north in the area of Galilee. There were a number of cities. Added to this was Tiberias, of course, for the Emperor Tiberius, the successor of Augustus. So these are the hallmarks, it is assumed, of client kingdoms. And it's assumed by Schur that this was typical of all of the client kingdoms. What I want to emphasize is this is the exception, not the rule. And it's dependent on the fact that Herod the Great's Roman citizenship was not a result of his acquisition of Judea and his being conferred as the king of Judea by the Romans. It was rather an inherited citizenship from his father, so that his citizenship was not dependent on being the king of Judea. It was rather the fact that his father had been a contributor to Julius Caesar in the campaign in Alexandria at the time of Cleopatra. As we will see as we go through this, these are exceptions, not really the rules, and I don't think that Herod should be looked at as typical. Let me illustrate that in the next few slides. Next. Just a couple of points. No inscription of Herod the Great in Judea identifies him as a friendly king, as an ally of the Roman people. nor does any inscription attest that he is a Roman citizen. And the second point is, if I were to ask you to draw a picture of Herod the Great, it would be purely hypothetical. There is no image of Herod the Great that we know of. His coins, next, illustrate this. There is no depiction of Herod on any of the coins. And the last sentence, I think, is off the screen, but in contrast to the coins of other kingdoms in the Roman world, where the image of the king is on the coin, there is no coin of Herod with his depiction, his portrait, his image, so that we are at the mercy of trying to not only reconstruct Herod with difficulty in Judea, but with some real problems. We know the reason for the lack of a depiction of an emperor in Judea, or a king rather in Judea, which I think this audience knows very well, that the iconoclastic nature of Judea probably prohibited Herod being celebrated on his coins. Next. But outside Judea, there's a lot of information about Herod that we have that illustrates his relationship to Rome pretty well. Next slide. In a dedicatory inscription at Kos that David Jacobson discussed very cleverly at the very beginning of its publication, illustrates that Herod is a Roman citizen. His name in this inscription in Kos is Gaius Julius Herodes. So you have the trianomina of a Roman citizen used for Herod the Great at Kos in Asia Minor. It illustrates that his citizenship goes back to his father's contribution, and that he has inherited kingship, rather citizenship. Next slide. And at a temple at Baal Shamin at Sia in Syria, an area that Herod the Great controlled for a period of time. This is a pretty poor slide that I took in, I think, sometime in the 1990s. I wish I could return with a digital camera and capture it again, but you can get the image here of 3 different layers of temples that were erected here. The one at the top is to Baal Shamin. Next. And the inscription that was found here indicates that a statue of Herod the Great was erected here. This is just, of course, the base of the statue that was erected, indicating its contributors. Next slide. I don't expect you to read that. And at the top, the inscription indicates that the King Herod had a statue erected here by the Ubishat, a tribe well known at Baal Shamin, who erected the temple in 33 and in 1 BCE, so that this temple had a whole string, as you can see, of dedications by various rulers. And this inscription indicates that Herod the Great was recognized by the local tribe. Next. And in an inscription found at Rome in the excavations of the Parthenon in the Acropolis, there is an inscription that says the people to King Herod, friend of Romans, because of his good works and goodwill toward the city. So Herod is a contributor not just to Judea, but to the Roman Empire at various other places. And I could illustrate this by Josephus, who mentions many of these contributions to various cities in the Levant. But this one is in Athens, reaching out to another area. So Herod is publicizing himself and his relationship to Rome outside of Judea. Next. And the successors of Herod the Great maintain this terminology. King Agrippa is the friend of the emperor. King Marcus Julius Agrippa is used with the trianomina again, showing his Roman citizenship, and in several inscriptions, in fact. So you begin to get the impression that the successors of Herod the Great are maintaining not only their citizenship as an inheritance, but also the terminology as friends of the Roman king, the Roman emperor, rather. Next. I have 5,000 slides, so we'll have to go quickly. I'm kidding. Maybe 50, but I think we did this. Next. In 20 BC, Herod met Augustus in Syria, where he was made epitropos, the procurator of Syria, with other procurators, dividing up the territory, and was appointed by Augustus as the administrator of Galilee, Bataea, Trachonitis, and Auranitis in southern Syria, placing him second to Agrippa. In 14 BC, Augustus entrusted Herod with the exploitation of copper mines at Cyprus in exchange for a payment of 30 talents. In addition, he appears to have been authority to collect taxes elsewhere. So Herod is not by any means locked into Judea. He is a possessor of territories outside of Judea that are very important. Next. I should mention at this time, there were embassies from South Arabia, from India, and from elsewhere to meet Augustus. So the emperor, in a sense, is a magnet for various kingdoms across the Roman world. The Herodian and Nabataean relations are indicated by two intermarriages that we know of. There is, first of all, the controversial affair between Sylleus, the Nabataean vizier, and Herod's sister Salome, who was in a romantic relationship with Sylleus, precipitating a number of scandalous traditions. But the point is, both Herod, who wanted to impose Jewish customs on Sylleus, which he rejected, and the Empress Livia both opposed the marriage. So it was not consummated. And this would have been probably, according to Kokinos, I think more appropriately, around 2021, rather than Josephus, who sets it in a context of 14 to 12 BCE, which seems to have been for some reason, a telescoping of a number of traditions that he puts together, but should be distinguished chronologically. And I say this because Sylleus was a young man, handsome at the time, not a decade later. I would say he had to be in his 30s. And I've noticed as the years have gone by, my appearance, if it ever was handsome, is less so as the years accumulate. So that I think it makes better sense to, with Kokkinos, to date this to an earlier period. And then the second marriage, as you know, this is the one that is better known, is Herod Antipas's marrying a Nabataean princess, the daughter of Aretas IV, whom he divorced to marry Herodias, his brother's wife, which precipitated a great deal of controversy. But the important thing is the result of these two attempts to intermarry between the two kingdoms produced a fierce opposition between the two realms, and a military conflict ensued between the two kingdoms. Next. Herod's succession was granted by Augustus on the basis of a will, and Herod was given the latitude of depicting or selecting his successor. Because of the palace intrigue at the time, this succession changed, and the will changed a number of times. So the importance of this is that Herod, although he was given latitude, and this is exceptional, unparalleled, still after the will was read, it had to be approved by the emperor, so that there was a process here of the will was not absolutely firm until Augustus's approval. Next. Now I'm going to make a transition. I know you were wondering when I'd get there. The Nabataean Kingdom is huge. The brown area here could be extended. The Sinai has probably more Nabataean, maybe 2/3 of the Nabataean inscriptions that exist. So it should be colored in brown as well. Most of these are dated after the annexation of the Nabataean Kingdom in 106, but a few of them date to an earlier period. And I don't think you can date all of them to the post-annexation period. There's probably a core that date to the earlier period. So the brown area is almost engulfing Judea. Of course, the argument is the Nabataeans controlled desert, not inhabitable lands, so that the cities and towns and villages are few across the Nabataean realm. Nevertheless, the territory is extensive from the Sinai, North Sinai coastal cities across the Negev. The problem with the Negev cities we really can't get into, but the point is the evidence for cities in the Nabataean period is very fragile, very few indications of settlements in the Negev. And then, of course, Petra. Now, the next slide. The Nabataean kingship begins with Herod Malichus I. I'm sorry, I need to proceed a little quicker. There are some signs of discord. In 40 BC, the Parthians invaded Syria, and a Roman procurator and governor imposed a fine on the Nabataeans because of their allegiance. And Herod the Great wanted to escape to the area, but was prohibited. And in an unpublished Safietic inscription by Zainaden, a Syrian scholar, who never published it formally, there is an allusion to the year in which Malichus, king of Nabataea, smote 30 centuries of Roman soldiers, whatever that means, whenever it took place. MacDonald suggested it may have taken place with the annexation of Syria in 63 or in the post-annexation period. But Malichus the first would seem to me to be the logical choice. And this period between 40 and 30 seems to me to be ideal for placing this inscription. But it's just a guess on my part. But it indicates that there was some confrontation between the Nabataeans and the Romans. Next. Cleopatra in 34 leased to Herod some lands of Arabia given to her by Antony and imposed the taxes on the Nabataeans of 200 talents. This seems to me to be exceptional in regard to quantity. I mean, 200 talents is quite a bit. Next slide. Having to hurry here. Next. With a transition to a new king after Malichus, there seems to be a relationship between Rome that is much more cordial and cooperative. What happened? I have no idea. Malichus was involved in a war with Herod the Great, stimulated by Antony in 31. It was victorious for Herod. And all of a sudden, a new king appears. What happened to Malichus? I have no idea. He disappears, and King Obotus emerges. And in 26 to 25, he provides his vizier Sylleus to accompany a Nabataean army of 1,000 and 500 Judeans to South Arabia. And the Nabataean vizier Sylleus is said by Josephus to have been a frequent visitor at Herod's court in Jerusalem in these years, when he was entertained and discussed business on a regular basis with the king. So there is cordiality, not only with Rome, but with the Judean kingdom at this time. Next. After Herod acquired the territory of the Trachonitis, there was a conflict in which Sylleus was involved, and financial obligations seemed to be at the heart of this controversy as well. He had loaned 500 talents to Obotus with 60 talents of interest. Next. Now, the point I want to make is that Herod's kingdom's taxation, as we know from Josephus, is far less than what is involved here. This would have been an enormous obligation imposed on the Nabataean king. Now, if we are to look at the Nabataean kingdom as a Rex Socius and as typical of the kingdoms across the empire, there's several things that need to be emphasized. No visit of a Nabataean king to Rome is ever mentioned. No Nabataean king is ever known to have received citizenship. No Nabataean king is ever described as a friend of the Romans. No Nabataean king sent his children to Rome. No Nabataean king erected or founded cities named after the emperor or the imperial family. Now, if you question whether or not the Nabataeans were allies of Rome, one only has to look at the first Jewish revolt. The Nabataeans supplied a huge contingent of its army for support of the Roman cause. So there is no dispute about that. But notice all of these things that are considered typical of kings, friendly kings, based on Herod the Great, are not duplicated by the Nabataeans. Next. Am I running out of time, Anthony? A few more minutes? Just a couple
fine,
of
David, you're fine.
Okay, the Nabataean kings are displayed in what I would call very Hellenistic, typical fashion. And I argued, and I think it was pretty well accepted. I know Israel Schatzman agrees with me that the Nabataean army was really based on the Hellenistic model, whereas the Judean army was based on the Roman model. So there's a distinction between the two. And I see a lot of Hellenistic influence at Petra in the architecture, in the nature of the city, as well as the representation of the kings. And the Nabataean queens are represented as Isis, with the headdress of Isis. And this is illustrated on the depiction of the Nabataean kings and queens on the coins that Raquel Barque has recently discussed in her new book on Nabataean coins. Next. So just an illustration of the Nabataean kings with the headdress of a Hellenistic monarch, not a crown, but this ribbon around the head with long curly locks, dreadlocks, we might call them, extending from their head. Next. And the Nabataean queens are represented with the headdress of Isis to the left, and this seems to be maintained by the various queens later, and also represented as Tyche, kind of on the obverse of the coins, as illustrated at the top. Next. I discussed this, by the way, in a recent article on the Nabataean ruler cult, which I look at as being Hellenistic. And the royal titles and epithets of the Nabataean kings that were used. Aratas says he was the lover or the one who loves or cares for his people, which is kind of an illustration of the Greek Philopatris, the lover of the fatherland. Rebel II is declared as the one who is given life and saves his people. In other words, the benefactor, and the protector of the kingdom is very typical of the Hellenistic period. Next. I'm not sure. I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. As a result of the conflict between the Nabataeans and the Judean kingdom, there the territory is a battleground between them. And the Judean Perea is typical. Next. In this area of Transjordan, Herod built a fortress at Hasmonean, where he took control of the region. He appointed his brother Pheroras as the tetrarch of Perea, and Pheroas's palace has probably been located at Beth-Ragamrapha, that is renamed Livia after, or Julius after the empress's wife. Next. This is not going to be very easy to see, but this is the area of the Dead Sea and just to the east. Next, I'm going to go through this quickly. There are some indications that Pheroas and the Nabataeans were pretty close. There are a number of indications of this in the literature, and the telltale sign seems to me to be some land that appears in the Babatha archive, in which it indicates there was an area called Pheroras's orchard. The name is very rare, and it seems to me that this is probably a royal estate right in the Nabataean area where Babatha grew up. Next. In an article on the Perea, I argue that the southern part of the Perea collapsed after Herod the Great's death and came under the rule of the Nabataeans. This is somewhat controversial, but it's based on a lot of archaeological work that has been done by various projects in the area in the last 30 or 40 years. Let me just summarize this quickly in concluding. Next. The Hasmoneans constructed a number of forts. I've listed them here, but it's too much to go through. Next slide. Next. This is the palace of Qasr al-Abad in Transjordan, which was a Tobiad residence. This palace has been reconstructed by the French over the last 30 or 40 years by Francois Larcher, and it seems to have come to a close in the 160s BCE. Next. So it was never really completed. Next. It's described by Josephus. There are a number of border okay. This is Herod's fort, probably called Herodium in Transjordan, according to Villeneuve. It's been pieced together. It's very nice here. I've been over this territory, and it's very difficult to reconstruct this. So this is a hypothetical proposal, but it is assumed that this is Herod's fortress later in the same area. Next. Almost done. Let's just take several cities to show. At Heshbon, sometime after Actium, Herod installed some cavalrymen at Esponitis, providing them with land allotments, but the traces of any occupation by a Jewish military colony in the area are minimal, if not absent. The coinage consists of several dozen Nabataean coins from Aratus IV to Rebel II, but none of Herod among over 400 coins in the corpus. The same enigmatic absence of Herodian coins appears at other sites in the southern Perea. Next. Almost done. At Nabataea, there is an extreme amount of Nabataean pottery, 964 sherds. 61 of them are the Deco phase 1 that dates from 120 to 50, which is very rare. So it's very unusual to have that many of these sherds for this early period. But it's assumed that Nabataea was occupied by a Nabataean elite or heavily Nabataeanized population. The conclusion is supported by the epigraphical evidence. We have the two stelae, funerary ones, of a Nabataean strategos at Nabataea in AD 37, which would have been probably at the time of the conflict between Herod and Aretas. Another Nabataean inscription also mentions the Amorot tribe that is well known in this area. Next. At Mount Nebo, the Herodian occupation appears to have ended with Herod's death in 4 BC. At Mount Nebo, just 5 kilometers northwest of Nabataea, there is an absence of Nabataean pottery, and it seems to date the pottery to the late Nabataean Hasmonean period. Here, that's all right. Let's go to the coin. A surface illustrated survey indicates a number of Hasmonean coins. These have been published, by the way, by Chaim Gittler at the Israel Museum. Here's a Hasmonean coin at Mount Nebo. Nothing of Herod, by the way. Next. Almost done. Next. Here's some stone vessels and a mikvah at Mount Nebo, but these probably date to the Hasmonean period. Next. The last illustration is Machaerus. At Machaerus, there's a puzzling gap between the Hasmonean period and Agrippa I. No coins of Herod or Herod Antipas have been found, as far as I know. And in the debris of a mikvah, a number of Nabataean pottery has been found, including a lot of the pottery that seems to have been produced by the Nabataeans in the Dead Sea area that has just been published. And this is crucial, it seems to me. In 30 BC around, the Nabataean princess who was married to Herod Antipas discovered his plans and asked to be removed to Machaerus, which was, as Josephus says, on the boundary between the Nabataean king and Antipas, where she could be passed by 3 various Nabataean strategoi to Petra and to her father. It would seem to me to be ironic if she wants to escape from Antipas, that she would be requesting to go to an area that was controlled by one of Herod's generals and was under his control. She rather wanted to go to an area where she could be safely and securely transported to the Nabataean king, her father, at Petra. There's an attempt to try to escape the conclusions that are mentioned here linguistically, but the point is the context is crucial here. The context seems to imply she's trying to escape to the Nabataean realm. Next. I think we have 2 more. Just a picture of Machaerus, which is being excavated by Varros now. 3 volumes have come out. Next. Next. Oh, Gabon, further to the south. I just wanted to emphasize that there's no indication of Hasmonean or Herodian presence there. After Herod's death in the 1st century, this comes under the occupation of the Nabataeans. And there's a long entranceway with a Nabataean gate and an entrance to a Nabataean temple published by Tushingham and Fred Winnett 40 years ago. So all of the area from the south and to the east and in the central area of the southern Perea, and I could have added a few more sites, seems to be under Nabataean control. So after Herod the Great's death, this area seems to have capsized. A truncated Perea must have existed. And Danny Sion and I have discussed this. It's fairly interesting. No coin of Herod Antipas has ever been found in the Perea. The end. I'm ready.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, David, for a wonderful lecture. We have some time now for questions. If people could please continue to put their questions into the chat. We can also invite you to speak in person if you unmute yourself, but please indicate first that you wish to speak rather than jumping in. Our first question is from Joseph Silver. Was the daughter of Aretas IV, Faziel, whom King Aretas featured on some of his coins?
I don't think so. The princess, you mean? Am I understanding this question correctly?
Yes.
The princess?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think the princess is depicted.
She's named.
Starkey proposed on the basis of, I think, an inscription that it was a certain princess, but a recent inscription by that's just been published in the date of Aretas IV lists another princess so we at least have 2 candidates. Raquel Barque proposes the second one. So we have several suggestions, but I don't know about being depicted on a coin. A princess on a coin?
No, she was mentioned on the coins. David Hendon made the point that she was not actually depicted, but mentioned by Aretas, by Aretas IV.
Yeah, that's possible. I don't know on the coin. I don't know about on the coin, but in an inscription. Go ahead. Sarah?
Then we have another question, although someone has already answered it, but I'll put it to you anyway. What do you make of the Hulda Gate in Second Temple, Jerusalem, in regards to Nabataean queens? Is there any connection to Herod's alliances to Nabataea?
It'd be adventurous for me to suggest that there is, but that's interesting. It's interesting that when Agrippa, Marcus Agrippa, pays a visit to Judea in 15, that there's a gate to the temple named after Agrippa. Boy, wouldn't you love to find that inscription? An inscription indicating that Agrippa II had a gate named after him entering the temple. There's possibilities, is what I'm saying.
Then from Robert Silverman, Herod was from Edomite family background. Was that a complication for Judean-Nabataean relations?
This is a tricky question that I'm sure there's a lot of literature on it that we don't have time to go into. supposedly the Idumeans have been converted, at least for a century before Herod the Great's death, so that maybe not quite a century, but close. So they have been Judaized to some extent. There is a great deal of literature about Herod in this regard. I find the interesting thing that maybe Tessa Rajak, who is a specialist in Josephus, has more information on, and I'll let her comment if she wishes. I shouldn't say let her, I would encourage her to comment if she wishes. The point is that the derogatory depiction of Herod the Great in Josephus is supposedly dependent on Nicolaus of Damascus. And Nicolaus of Damascus seems to have been characterized as a flatterer of Herod. So how do you get a flatterer depicting a monster on the throne, killing his family members right and left? That I can't resolve. That seems to me to be, I propose that Nicolaus may have written this later, but that's only hypothetical. It's a real problem for me.
Tessa, did you want to come in there?
Thank you. Well, only really just I was thinking that the monster stuff makes such good dramatic history that it's irresistible, and we may overestimate the consistency of Nicolaus. Though it's true, I mean, it's often been argued that it must have been posthumous if it comes from him. We also have Strabo's account, which we don't know is lost from his great histories. So it's it seems to me to be a very complicated question that we're not going to resolve, but absolutely. I also wanted to ask, if I might, very quickly, about other client kings were excluded from the discussion. Obviously, these in some ways are the best attested, though the Nabataeans only from archaeology. But at least in subsequent decades, we do see the very client kings in the area of what is now Turkey, you know, Ptolemy of Cilicia and so on and so forth, into which the Herodian dynasty in its later manifestations married, behaving pretty similarly to the Herodians, but maybe Herod was the prototype. They are linked with Rome, they intermarry. I think they are allies of the Roman people and so on. So is it a case of Herod being the precursor to what became a bit more of a pattern?
Yeah, the interesting point. As I said, Richard Sullivan deals with this intermarriage, which he looks at as just a primary motif of all of these client kingdoms, to be wedding together and joining forces by these intermarriages. So that's interesting. I want to go back to the question. I mean, Herod the Great is responsible for the erection of the temple and a number of other projects within Judea that are primarily Jewish. So to argue that Herod the Great, because he's Idumean, is not sympathetic with Jewish interests, and it's a very difficult question, of course, but he's obviously trying either to appease the Jewish factions within Judea or is sympathetic with the Jewish factions in Judea. But the temple is an amazing project that lasted till started in 20 and lasted till 64. I mean, that's 84 years of contributions that are being made by Herod and his successors in the erection of the temple. One could go to Jericho and the excavations there, the Herodian palaces and so forth. But it's difficult to say that because Herod is an Idumean that he's not sympathetic with the Jewish religion or with Judaism. I think it'd be very difficult to draw a line there. Thank you, Tessa, for your comments. It's so good to see you.
Well, this is, I wouldn't have missed this. It's been terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have a few more questions from Anthony Rabin. Client king, sons to Rome, friends or hostages? Question mark.
Are they friends or hostages?
Mm-hmm.
I would say friends.
Sorry, David, just to be less enigmatic, the sending of sons to Rome often served, it seems to me, a number of different purposes. And the further east that one went, the more nakedly they were hostages, certainly with the stream of Parthian and near Parthian sons. I just wondered whether, even within the context of the so-called friendly kings, it wasn't a bad insurance policy, particularly, as you said, that these were bastions of the border, but should they be persuaded to change their minds, their sons were, of course, in a different place from them.
I think that's a good point, but I also think that the complexity of all of these kingdoms is at stake. When the Parthians invaded in 40, a number of these friendly kings went to the Parthian cause, and they had to pay an indemnity because of that. So there is a fluctuation, especially, as you say, in the East, because of the rise of the Parthians and the interaction there. And the sympathy of the Nabataeans is involved here as well. So what I'm suggesting is it's complex. It depends on the kingdom and the circumstances and their posture. So that an insurance would be if they have a son at Rome, it could be used as a hostage to persuade them to go the other way. So it's an excellent point you're making.
Thanks.
I'm not in control.
Sorry. Question from William Rains. Josephus mentions John the Baptist was imprisoned at Machaerus. Does that not raise problems if you argue that the fortress was under Nabataean control by 30?
David Jacobson is pushing me on this question as well. I have a hard time with Josephus at this point. At the point where he says the Nabataeans are in control of Machaerus, after that, he says that John the Baptist was at Machaerus. Machaerus just doesn't seem to me to be appropriate for this whole circumstance. And the implications are that the whole setting of this affair is in Galilee, where Antipas was the ruler. If John the Baptist was going to be in prison, I would suggest it would be at the capital of the Perea, which would be nearby where he was operating. So I have trouble with Josephus at this point. He seems to me to be contradicting himself, and I'm not the expert on Josephus, but I've read Josephus carefully enough to know that there are problems galore with his chronology and with certain allusions. So it is a problem, and I'd have to say, Alvin, I'll illustrate it with just one point. Malichus supposedly is being assailed by Herod the Great in 31 at the Battle of Actium. And yet, according to Plutarch, he sends his army to help Anthony at Actium. Huh? Why would he? Did he have troops that he could spare in a war that he was losing to send to Anthony in Greece at the time of Actium? I don't think so. And so Bowersock questions it as a error, and I would only the comment of Plutarch is it's the Malichus of Arabia. That seems to me to be the Malichus that's involved, but I think it's a real problem. So Tessa Rajak is the authority, but I think she would say there are a lot of problems in Josephus. I'm just giving you one illustration.
And we have a question, which is probably really a comment from Joseph Silver, referring to something you said, David, about Herod and the temple. Restoration of the temple, not erection, surely.
You mean the temple in Jerusalem?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, I think the temple, I mean, the foundation is obviously something that is so primary. I think it was erected during that period of time. I don't think it's a restoration. I think it's a creation. The temple, once again, I hate speaking here about subjects where there's authorities present, where I can just throw out my views and not have to worry. But David Jacobson has written about the Temple of Jerusalem. But from what we know is it was a reorganization of the whole temple platform. So that I think that it's a creation rather than a restoration. 80 years to restore? I don't think so.
Do you want to come back, Joseph, on that?
Oh,
We'll agree to disagree.
What's that?
As a believing Jew, I don't accept that. But David has his opinion, and I have my opinion, so not a problem. I'll go with ours.
Okay, we'll have lunch again then.
Yeah, no problem. You're welcome.
May I just add something here? That the description in Josephus of Herod's building of his, or the rebuilding of the temple, I should say, does indicate that it was rebuilt from the ground up. When you read about, for example, his description of the building of the sanctuary. So I think it's fairly clear from that source that it is in fact a new construction on the original site and based on the original plan, but a rebuild, a full rebuild nonetheless.
The check is in the mail.
Sounds like this would be a good topic for a future lecture. We have another question. Robert Silverman, a great mystery regarding the Nabataeans is what happened to them after their kingdom disappeared. They reverted to nomadism and forgot their civilization?
No. I don't think they disappear. As I indicated, there are a lot of inscriptions now from the post-Nabataean period. The idea was that the Nabataeans collapsed completely with Augustus taking control of the trade routes and funneling them into Egypt. But we now have over 1,000 inscriptions from the area northwest Saudi Arabia published by Leila Naimi just recently, in which a number of them indicate that that trade continued to function with Nabataeans. There's 900, almost 1,000 Nabataean inscriptions, mentioning Astrategos, guards, so forth, in what's called the Darb al-Bakra. It's available on the internet, so you can look at them. And there are Jews and Moabites who are involved in the trade. So that trade continued to function. Only one, I think, out of 8 dated inscriptions dates to the pre-annexation period. All of the others date to the post-period. And we know about the development of a number of sanctuaries, for example, in Jordan after the annexation in the Petra area. So that I think it's very difficult to think that Nabataeans disappeared. They were transformed, and a number of Nabataean names appear in inscriptions afterwards. So they're still visible and active. Leila Nami has also published a number of military inscriptions from Jauf in North Arabia and Saudi Arabia of Nabataean army after the annexation, so that the Nabataeans are continuing to function. That they disappear, the number of Nabataean inscriptions at Petra are 0 after the annexation. So there is a great transition to the use, and the Babata archive indicates that as well, that the Nabataean or Aramaic documents begin to get less and less, and then they become totally Greek, so that emerging is difficult. The inscriptions at Petra from a number of areas in the papyri, the Petra papyri, indicate Nabataean names are still being used and that the tradition continues. So that I don't think they disappear. They are just absorbed into the Roman Empire.
Thank you, David. We have another comment about the temple, about the Talmud's report that Herod entirely raised the temple, built it again from scratch. Reports that the rabbis were anxious it would never be rebuilt. And then a question about the Nabataeans. According to the Islamic Hadith, there were Nabataean traders with the same culture even in the 8th and 9th century. And there's a further comment, and Nabataeans converted to Christianity. I don't know if you want to react to those points.
I can't. I'm not. I know enough about the Mishnah and the Talmud to stay away. Okay, I'm not a authority, so I don't want to get involved in that. The problem is the word Nabataean appears in other literature in Iraq and elsewhere, and whether these are Nabataeans or not has ensued a little literature and debate. So I think it's controversial.
Do we have any?
The word Nabataean means digger, and so the question is, are these just diggers?
Do we have any further questions before we bring matters to a close? Well, I think we've worked you extremely hard, David, with the questions, and on behalf of the Society, I just want to express enormous thanks to you for a magnificent lecture and this wonderful presentation. And really, we're very much looking forward to hearing about what happens when you go to Jordan and what you will do there in the future. So enormous thanks to you, and we hope we will see you again. You come back and tell us about the next phase of your work on Nabataea.
I'd be glad to return, and thank you very much for introducing me to a whole different kind of audience that I haven't had before. It was very nice to be with you, and so many distinguished people. Thank you so much.
It's a great privilege.
I have a doctor's appointment in 45 minutes.
We will allow me then just to reiterate our thanks, and also to announce that our next lecture, which is free to all, 27th of October at 5 o'clock British, will it be British summertime by then? Yeah. I don't know. will be delivered by our very own Professor Hugh Williamson on the topic of old but still topical, the dispute between Driver and Sayce on biblical archaeology. So is there anything else to add, Anthony, before we go?
No, I don't think so, Sarah.
Nope. So very many thanks to David, to Anthony for running the PowerPoint, to Sheila for organizing everything so brilliantly, and very much look forward to seeing, I hope to seeing many of you, if not all of you, at our next lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll be present.